Okay, so we are going to move on to our first in-person presenter. So, right, introducing Sarah Westvik, who is a MA student of International War Studies at the University College Dublin and University of Potsdam, focusing on trauma and memory in the Pacific theatre of the Second World War. They have previously spoken on Middle-earth's political dynamics at Tolkien 2019 and Númenorian imperialism at Oxenmoot 2021, and are currently working on a paper about Elendil, forthcoming at the International Medieval Congress of this week. Please do follow. They co-host the Tolkien Experience podcast and contribute to the Silmarillion's Writers Guild's A Sense of History column. Outside of Tolkien, they work and volunteer at literary, educational, and Sarah prevention non-profits. Can we please give a round of applause for Sarah?
Okay, so hello, everybody. Nice to see all of you. The talk that I'm going to be doing today is the first stage in an analysis I'm conducting into trauma and the suite of symptoms used in Western clinical psychology to diagnose post-traumatic stress disorder, and how these conditions may be said to be identifiable to varying degrees within Tolkien's legendarium outside the Third Age. Much has been written, of course, about resonances of Tolkien's primary world experiences of trench warfare during the First World War, whether in context of his own life or applicability to his fiction. Frodo's experience as a ring bearer, for example, has been a key case of this. Where my objective in this paper is to apply a little of what I currently research outside Tolkien studies, so namely trauma and PTSD during the Second World War in Singapore, which involves a holistic view of qualitative literature pertaining to trauma and trauma responses when analyzing witness accounts, both written and oral. The stories of the Akallabêth's protagonists, as they're written in universe by witnesses, are very close to basically what I do in real life. So my aim is to show the early phases of this research, unpacking aspects of trauma and memory studies and understanding Númenor as a historic tale of legendary importance that has sunk its claws into Middle-earth's hide precisely because of the enduring awe and terror of its traumatic end. I'd like to give a warning that due to the nature of this topic, I'll be touching on some difficult themes, including depression and suicidal ideation. So if at any point you feel you need to step away for your own well-being, please do so. So first, an outline of what trauma and post-traumatic stress are. There are three kind of core components at the heart of trauma. First, it's the event itself. Per the American Psychological Association's DSM-5 diagnostic criteria, a traumatic event is defined as, quote, exposure to actual threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence, unquote. The definition is a decent base, but it's rigid and in itself, and also when based on an individual's experience of an event, which varies and is actually the second component. So are they a direct victim, say, of a violent attack? Or are they an immediate bystander to, say, a car crash? Or perhaps they're watching a disaster play out in their home country, but via the television. So the final layer, therefore, is the effects that the event has with relation to both of these things, which can trigger either acute, so short-term, or chronic trauma responses based on numerous factors and comorbidities. The effect can leave a person, quote, rendered helpless by overwhelming force, unquote, at the moment of trauma as it overwhelms ordinary systems of care, the ones that give a person a sense of control, connection, or meaning in their life. This can in turn result in the development of disorders, including anxiety, depression, and PTSD. One might see the breakdown of relationships or blaming oneself for what's happened or trying to rationalize a random act of violence. The memory might be warped or blocked out. One may experience flashbacks, intrusive thoughts, or nightmares. And there is significant comorbidity with depression, substance misuse, and premature mortality, for example, via suicide. In some people, though, trauma can also result in more positive outcomes, so to speak, such as a new sense of purpose, which is referred to as post-traumatic growth. Most traumatic stressors, it should be noted, do not lead to chronic PTSD. The WHO's World Mental Health Survey, oh Lord, finds that while trauma is common, particularly say from natural disasters, the most persistent symptoms of PTSD are highlighted in specific traumatic incidences, the most prevalent being combat experience and sexual violence. There are limitations in the evidence base due to recall bias and interpretation and management being affected by cultural variation. As an example, within Afghanistan and refugee populations, there's a rich vocabulary of idioms of distress. So they don't by default mean PTSD or depression, but they should be interpreted in the sociocultural context, so diagnosis isn't based on a rigid definition. And it's specifically because of this that I find that reading the legendarium within its language, rather than imposing a set symptomology, may better reveal resonances of trauma and PTSD. So with the analysis to follow, I'll be applying some of these aspects of fallout to the experiences of witnesses, namely Elendil and Isildur, but also briefly exploring resonances in the Third Age. Yes, come save me, thank you. Yeah, 1 second. There you are. Cheers. Is this thing on? Yes. Okay. Amazing. So let's start this by talking about the frame narrative of the text. We can treat the Second Age texts, in my view, the Akallabêth and the disaster of the Gladden Field, which is what I'll be talking about today, somewhat as primary source analysis. The text of the Akallabêth, as well as the text of Aldarion and Arendis, although I'm not consulting that today, are written by Elendil within Tolkien's frame narrative. Much like the first-hand accounts of, say, Alexander, written by generals like Ptolemy, this makes the Akallabêth therefore not just history alone, but also, in effect, an exercise in a kind of memoir. Memory studies these days have moved towards memory as a fluid and imaginative process in which the memory is remade every time remembering happens. When this becomes intertwined with a traumatic event, research finds that texts written by traumatized individuals, whether fiction adjacent, or non-fiction, are characterized by fluidity, gaps, silences, and fragmentations, which testify to the trauma. So because traumatic events are themselves lapses in the natural order of things, quote, the imaginative quality of literary narrative allows it to access the traumatic experience and gesture towards or evoke trauma. And so because these texts are written by Tolkien, who was a World War I veteran, I find the Legendarium therefore a very unique literary vehicle to examine resonances of trauma, however unintentional or intentional. It's not my goal with this current paper to look into intentionality at all. The Gladden Field is similar in the fact that we don't know the author, but we do know that it's a first-hand account garnered from Dunedain witnesses, namely Ohtar, Isildur's squire, referred to by his rank rather than his name, and Estelmo, the squire of Elendur, Isildur's firstborn. Others on the scene were woodmen living in the eaves of the Greenwood, elves dispatched by Thranduil, and all accounts were filtered through second-hand conveyance and informed by evidence obtained during the Fourth Age under Aragorn's reign. Tolkien himself refers to it as surmise but well-founded and as still a legend. While a function of the pseudo-historical nature of the text, it does provide an interesting frame by which to understand trauma because it allows for aforementioned gaps and ambiguities. When reading the text of the Gladden Field, it is deeply personal and emotive within these gaps and ambiguities. So while ostensibly within the frame, a historical text, the choice of its telling of all the events in Middle-earth's history that Tolkien could choose to dramatize in full demonstrates that, quote, historical objective of archival language fails to capture traumatic experience. So even though it's a historical text, they're deliberately using emotive language, which I will illustrate shortly. So in summary, as Leigh says, quote, narrative fiction might capture the feel of traumatic experience, even if it does not aim to reproduce facts, unquote. So let's talk about Númenor. The big hallmark of being Númenorian is being both a person and a nation in exile. If exile is traumatic, it isn't necessarily the displacement process, but the, quote, harrowing events before, during, or after dislocation that can lead to suffering of clinical proportions, unquote. These things create resonances by which one can later understand the yearning that survivors feel for their lost homeland. What are the harrowing events? How shall we understand them for the nation and for individuals? Well, the Akallabêth is a narrative of person-to-person violence, natural disaster, and forced migration. These are three factors, and in fact, from research done about children in Sri Lanka in the wake of civil conflict that occurred at the same time as the 2004 tsunami in the Indian Ocean, we know that the combination of traumatic events, both man-made and natural, did lead to a prevalence of chronic disorders, including PTSD, rather than just acute or short-term trauma and stress reactions. So, with that in mind, we can understand why the trauma of the Akallabêth becomes so enduring because of numerous comorbidities. In the Akallabêth, Tolkien writes about the spilling of blood and torment and great wickedness, as well as the faithful being specifically selected by the king's men under Sauron's leadership to be victims. He talks about men slaying each other in the streets and how madness and sickness assailed them and they were afraid to go out into the dark. And men took weapons in those days and slew one another for little cause, for they would become quick to anger. And Sauron went about the land setting man against man, so that people murmured against the king and the lords, and the men of power to cruel revenge. These events are also long drawn out. They don't happen over a day. Númenor didn't fall in a day. It took Sauron 3 years to gain the king's ear, and Númenor took a little while longer to sink into the sea. So the ongoing violence leads to more vulnerability for chronic stress reactions due to sustained incidences of stress. This is the same way that PTSD can develop in veterans. Heightened stress over numerous weeks or months leads to an increased vulnerability for PTSD. Though the caveat does remain that to this day, research still is inconclusive as to what specific vulnerabilities make certain people more likely to develop PTSD in these heightened stress situations, because not everybody does, or to different extents. So just a reminder that all of this Númenorian content is being told from the pen of Elendil. So the traumatic incidents captured here are captured by witness, either as a direct participant or to 1 or 2 degrees removed. Recall again that the DSM-5 criteria is considered narrow and hinges upon a specific framework of Western clinical diagnostic language. So what can cause a person to be traumatized is more complicated than simply being a direct victim of a specific kind of violence. We can argue then, speaking for the collective as well as personal trauma, Elendil is imposing his responses not just to what he experienced himself, but what he saw occurring to other people in his ill-fated country of birth, using the allowance of literary language to capture and spotlight traumatic events in his history in the emotive way that perhaps more clinical or factual reporting could not. So with that summary of the collective aspect of Númenorian trauma, let's then talk about the man himself, Elendil. We'll always find excuses to talk about. So some of the things that I mentioned earlier, some of the comorbidities are depression, blaming oneself for what happens, rationalizing an act of violence, and suicidal ideation. To varying degrees, we find all of these within Elendil's narrative as he describes what happens to himself. The first, of course, is familial loss. Grief is traumatic, and it can be a comorbidity of PTSD, but itself can be just acute trauma. When he loses Amandil, and Amandil's words actually emphasize already themes of exile and senses of death before these themes are revisited later on in the narrative. He says that you shall lose all that you have loved for tasting death in life, seeking a land of exile elsewhere. And then we see that these themes recur for Elendil. In the first, when he journeys, quote, in secret to the western shores and gazed out over the sea, sorrow and yearning were upon him, and he greatly loved his father, unquote. We hear of yearning for the first time. So let me here bring up the term nostalgia, the importance of which will become apparent in a minute. Johannes Hofer in 1678 made an observation by the behaviors of Swiss soldiers fighting abroad. He documented, quote, a serious life-threatening form of homesickness, unquote, classed as, quote, a mental condition or nervous disorder, which he dubbed nostalgia, unquote. While this isn't any longer considered a disorder, resonances of it can be seen in how, quote, migrant groups have been linked to higher incidences of diseases, including depression, unquote. This carries on for both Elendil and the exiled Númenorians in general, as opposed to immigrant or refugee, quote, exile evokes notions of guilt and innocence or just and unjust suffering, unquote, and is also often characterized by an alienated condition. Sayad's La Double Absence talks about how the subject remains physically both in the former home and the new host country, as well as the past and the present, in an ambiguous state of twin identities, recreating the homeworlds and childhoods in their fiction. In terms of what Sayad was writing about, was about authors writing fiction, could easily be applied to semi-fiction or non-fiction accounts, essentially paralleling the present with the past. And we find that this nostalgia returns again and again for Elendil as a person, as well as for Númenorians in general. Elendil has Gil-galad erects for Elendil the Emin Beraid, what I like to call his yearning towers, where he goes up and yearns across the sea, looking for glimpses of Númenor. And this becomes a habit. This is habitual. This is not something that he lets go. And this is made very clear in the text. For the Númenóreans more broadly, they longed ever to escape from the shadows of their exile, to see some fashion of the light that dies not, for the sorrow of the thought of death had pursued them over the deeps of the sea. So clearly, like, sorrow is a thing, sorrow and grief. These traumatic experiences have pursued them. So they're no longer just acute, they are lasting, they are chronic. Furthermore, the use of the word shadow as a visual clad of trauma is something that recurs over and over again in the legendarium. I draw here a link as well to something I don't have time to talk about today, but is a specific line about Thranduil in the Unfinished Tales, where following the latter lines, it talks about how he could not forget the horror of Mordor, and it darkened his vision whenever he looked south. Thus, traumatic events and the language of shadow are intrinsically linked explicitly and implicitly. Finally, with regards to Elendil, we have the aspect of suicidal ideation. During the foundering of the ships, there's this one phrase that says, "But when the devouring wave rolled over the land and Númenor toppled to its fall, then Elendil would have been overwhelmed and would have deemed it the lesser grief to perish, for no wrench of death could be more bitter than the loss and agony of that day." So in terms of studies about PTSD, both ideation and attempts are logged as comorbidities to having PTSD, with the latter being unfortunately more quantifiable than the former due to issues of self-selection in research, but nevertheless resonates with the symptomology of trauma responses, which sometimes fit into the classic post-traumatic stress disorder categorizations, and other times reflects conditions akin to grief, fear of anxiety, pointing to conditions such as depression, which can be a comorbidity for suicidal ideation. So then let's move briefly on to Isildur. With Isildur's storyline, during the downfall, we don't get a sense that he is necessarily experiencing acute or lasting trauma. Even when he is assailed during his attempt to steal the fruit from Nimloth, well, he succeeded. It's explicitly written that after he was wounded, he later arose and was troubled no more by his wounds. So in this case, the wounds do not last. But as we know from examples like Frodo, there are cases where wounds can last and become a physical manifestation of remembered trauma. And this changes for Isildur after the War of the Last Alliance, less so than the Akallabêth. So in 3429, Isildur is forced to flee after the attack of Minas Ithil. Within 11 years, he loses his brother, and the next year he loses his father. And then we have Isildur's very famous line about claiming the ring as weregild for his father's death and for his brother's. And just a sentence later, I find it notable that Tolkien connects Isildur keeping the ring with making a memorial for Anarion. He says, "Taking it, the ring, therefore he returned at first to Minas Anor and there planted the white tree in memory of his brother Anarion." The ring here, therefore, becomes the vehicle by which we understand trauma and the notion of nostalgia as a stand-in for other comorbidities such as grief or depression. The ring becomes part of the way Isildur processes or doesn't process his experiences as much as his acts of memorial. It is part of his immediate post-war actions, is holding on to that ring. The nature of the ring as a vehicle for inflicting and sustaining pain that by its nature cannot also be mastered and is difficult to escape is very much what the ring is about when it comes to trauma. There's resonance here with the nature of trauma as burden and how the pressure exerted by it cannot be escaped. Memory is heavily connected to the body, as I mentioned, and in the case of the ring, it connects to physical as much as psychological pain. Isildur describes how the ring was hot when I first took it, hot as a gleed, so that I doubt if I ever again I shall be free of the pain of it. And he also says, "It's precious to me, though I buy it with great pain." The ring is thus explicitly tied to pain that cannot be escaped and to Isildur's post-war experience and responses to grief. He takes it willingly, as one may willingly take on the burden of going into a situation where trauma may occur, like a war zone, but that willingness is stripped when it comes to letting the ring go. And so then we get to the disaster of the Gladden Fields, a highly traumatic event itself, which doesn't allow much room to examine the impact of trauma because everybody dies, except for Ohtar, Estelmo, and one unnamed other, which is how we get the story. but the language used in the telling couches the past event in phrases that choose to emphasize the traumatic impact of the events on the protagonists, and even imagine the trauma faced by the protagonists when the narrative goes into what Isildur experiences alone when he's fleeing. None of the people who in universe shared the narrative could have known what was going through Isildur's mind when he fled by himself, but it's included in an ostensibly historical narrative. So it's so hard to move this with two fingers. So it speaks of, there's the overheard conversation between Elendil and Isildur, which can be said, okay, it was overheard, that is legitimate. But when it goes on, it talks about how as Isildur flees, he was in great pain and anguish of heart, and he ran like a stag from the hounds. He put the ring upon his finger with a cry of pain. All of this language about, and also how he felt lost and alone, a small creature in the wilds of Middle-earth. Nobody was there to witness that, but they have said it. So returning briefly to the ring, before I come back to that, as a vehicle of trauma, the ring gives him brief respite before his passing, and this is included in the narrative as well. It left his hand, and so overwhelming was his sense of loss, he struggled no more and would have sunk and drowned. But swift as it had come, the mood passed. The pain left him, a great burden had been taken away. It has resonance perhaps in the way traumatic burdens can pass through phases of impact upon a person. Frodo, in giving up the ring, found relief, but the enduring trauma returns in specific moments, anniversaries, and ultimately stays with him. Had Isildur lived, we may have seen something similar, or perhaps he would have moved towards post-traumatic growth. We don't know, because he unfortunately perished. But one interesting thing I found that Tolkien wrote was that he said, at the conclusion of Gladdenfield, so passed the first victim of the malice of the Masterless Ring, Isildur, second king of the Dunedain, lord of Arnor and Gondor. Of all authors, Tolkien is not accidental with language, and so I find it notable that he chooses to refer to Isildur as a victim. It emphasizes the way that the ring, this encompassing shadowy force of grief and of trauma, can strip a person's agency. And Tolkien's axis of moral failure, as described with regards to Frodo, and the increasing physical and mental torments laid upon him, says that his ultimate failure in destroying the ring is one that can't be judged with any force of malice because of these pressures. So the greater and more numerous external pressures, the less moral failure can be said to apply to their actions, even if the action itself is a failure. So the great pain and torment that Isildur felt becomes intrinsic to the narrative itself, a narrative kept by people who are not him, and a narrative that endures on a national level, one that paints him as somebody who, yes, was prideful, but was faced with trauma, was faced with pressures, and is ultimately characterized as a victim of the power of the ring, of the burden that was placed upon him at the end of the war. So this isn't bare bones history. Evoking trauma is essential to remembering the Gladden fields within the frame narrative of Middle-earth, just as it is to remembering the Akallabêth. To give a final few short notes regarding the Third Age, is that the notion of witnesses becomes interesting when you are past the time of living memory. Of course, you have immortals in Middle-earth, so Elrond has witness memory to history, but with other people, mortals, people whose stories these are, the national narrative, they would not have known in living memory. It's like for us, I was remarking to a friend the other day how now, so my generation, Gen Z, will be the last who have looked in the eyes of World War II survivors. So the next generations are not going to have, they're not going to have witnessed it, and they're not going to have witnessed people who witnessed it. So there will be an additional degree of separation that turns lived experiences more and more into stories and legends. That's already the case, say, for the First World War. So in a similar way, we lose that proximity with the mortal characters whose nations own these stories when we get into the Third Age, but we see that it still resonates very far down the line in Faramir's famous dream about the wave that John Rosegrant in his essay about Tolkien and the Great War talks about how the dream, Tolkien's Atlantis dream itself, that inspired Faramir's dream, was in many ways a traumatic dream in itself. And so one could almost assert that the fall of Númenor is therefore, springing from this dream, has trauma actually woven directly into its collapsed bedrock from the beginning, and as such is woven into the memory of rock and stone as much as living descendants. So Where to from here with the future of this research? The next steps that I'm going to take are to firm it up with further case studies looking at other trauma responses following natural disasters, as well as looking more deeply into post-traumatic growth and how that might have resonances in the legendarium, particularly Second Age. I hope that this has proved to be an interesting overview of how our present understanding of trauma and stress responses and post-traumatic stress and other disorders can resonate within the text, not just because of the nature of a literary approach that allows room for trauma to be evoked on the page, but because the framed narrative itself explicitly emphasizes the intertwining of personal and collective traumatic experiences within historical or pseudo-historical narratives. So I thank you for your attention and welcome any questions you may have.
This working, isn't it? Yep, yep, yep. Right, Sarah, thank you so much. That was such, I keep on coming back to this idea that we have such a diverse, different range of papers, and you're just really emphasizing that. So thank you very much for bringing your expertise in this field to us. I'd never heard of post-traumatic growth. So continuing this idea, we're all learning in this process as well. Thank you. Okay, so online, if you've got a Q&A, if you've got a question, please do use the Q&A function. And Easter at the front, I'm just going to give you this one.
Sarah, that was brilliant. Really, really good. And I'm
Thank
looking
you.
forward to seeing where you're going. I work at a war museum and Imperial War Museums. And we talk a lot about that. And one of the things that I'd be interested in your reflections on is, do you think that the Akallabêth is a history, or is it a traumatic memory? And what coloring do you see in the Akallabêth that might show that idea that this is more a memory than a history by someone who kind of lived through it? Because at the museum we talk a lot about that. I'll hear a veteran talking about an experience, and what they're saying is not historically correct, but it's what they remember. So be interesting.
So yeah. So fun fact, I actually used to volunteer online for the IWM. I don't anymore, but I used to. So exciting. Okay. But yeah, it's actually a really, really interesting question. It's something that I grapple with a lot in my current research, because I look at primary accounts, especially oral history from survivors of the Second World War in Singapore. And this is always an aspect that comes through, is basically what defines the reality of history, what defines the objectivity of history, because there are certain records that we can have now, especially for modern warfare. You can have like written things, you can have telegrams, you can have battle maps, that sort of thing, so you know what happened. But how much of history is actually informed by experience? Because that should, in my view, that should be what makes history a field that we preserve, is because of how people respond to it. And so for me, the Akallabêth does kind of straddle the line between being a history and between being a memoir, because it does point to specific incidences. It points to things that could probably be corroborated if you picked up reports from multiple other survivors of the Akallabêth and got a little bit scientific about it. But just by itself as a source, that's why I sort of drew the comparison to the memoirs of Alexander's generals, because yeah, you can corroborate certain things within it, but within those narratives, you have certain value judgments that are made about particular decisions, or that justify something that they themselves did, or convey something about how they themselves felt. I think that it's really notable that if Elendil is the in-universe author, that he specifically talks about, his personal grief, that he talks about feeling like he wants to die after the Akallabêth. That he talks like but there are gaps in it. That's why I emphasize as well how with literary narratives, it allows for gaps in the narrative. And this is the thing about the Akallabêth that makes me say that it errs closer towards memory, because there are a lot of gaps. There's a lot of fluidity in what happens. The language couches things in that fluidity. That kind of allows you to say, and that's why, I love Elendil a lot, but I always say that the Akallabêth is Elendil propaganda, because it really frames it in a way that is highly sympathetic to the faithful, and not necessarily wrongly, because again, objectively, if they were being killed in droves, yeah, that is traumatic, and you have a strong right to feel grief over that. But again, it is really a singular perspective of the downfall, a kingsman, perhaps somebody who didn't even have rabid, radical convictions, maybe just somebody who sympathized with it because they were afraid of dying. They would have a complete other perspective on the Akallabêth. So for me, I tend to treat it more in the way that I would treat memoir, more in the way that I would treat primary sources when I research them in history, and less so history itself, because I would want to corroborate that with a lot more secondhand accounts. That was a really long answer, but yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, super, fantastic question. And yet again, we're getting some really detailed, in-depth answers, and I love it. So thank you. Okay, we still have no answers from our online audience, so they're clearly mulling over our trauma paper. Any more questions from our in-person audience? Yes.
Thank you. It's very interesting. So I'm sorry if my question maybe sounds too clinical, but I'm just wondering, did you use or did you consider also diagnostic criteria from ICD-11 about PTSD to make this analysis? And would you say that, I mean, I don't know how much ICD-11 different from DSM-5, but maybe would you say there will be other thing that you can add to that, considering the ICD-11 maybe it's more applicable to different culture than DSM-5?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really glad you brought that up because I wasn't aware of ICD-11. So there we go. I did only use DSM-5 for this analysis because I wasn't going too clinical with this one. But as the research expands, it will be very good to look at that, because one thing that you get to understand with these with these trauma studies, and the reason I brought up that study with Afghan refugees is because they use really specific idiomatic language to talk about symptoms that one might use in a symptomology to diagnose post-traumatic stress disorder. I can't think of the words off the top of my head, but they are tied a lot to physical symptoms. One of them, the word literally translates to sickness of the liver, but it actually refers to a kind of a depression, a kind of wasting that one could, in combination with other comorbidities, use to diagnose post-traumatic stress disorder. And it's why there are actually these days, there are a lot of issues with diagnosing any kind of acute or chronic trauma responses in refugee populations, because they might have different idiomatic language to talk about what they're experiencing, how they're experiencing it, how they're processing certain traumatic events. So I'm really glad you brought that up, because I will definitely use it to cross-check as the research expands. And I'm definitely going to continue to be cross-referencing and hopefully finding more studies about idiomatic language to kind of expand how we can look at and how we can talk about trauma. But that's why I really like that, with the Legendarium. It's a lot to do with language and the implications of language. And when you can draw those lines between different, say the word shadow, how that's used in different contexts, you can see how it can be idiomatic for a particular traumatic experience. So yeah, thank you for that. I'm going to be looking into it when I revise the paper.